Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargava, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In this episode, we talk about the government strategizing to counter the negative commentary against it. We also talk about the first presidential statement by the United Nations Security Council regarding the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But first, we talk about wheat flour or Atta. The price of wheat flour has been increasing for the past few months. In fact, last month, the All India monthly average retail price of wheat flour at 32.38 rupees per kg was at a record high. And this is because the production and the stock of wheat in India has fallen. And this has happened despite the fact that India was expecting a bumper crop this time. In this segment, Harish Damodaran, Indian Express's Rural Affairs editor, joins us to talk about why this has happened.
I think the Atta prices have been rising basically in the last 2-3 months onwards. And the main reason is because wheat is not available. We have had a very short crop. My guess is our wheat production this year has fallen maybe 15 to 20%, okay, minimum. So therefore, the government also doesn't have any stocks. Our wheat procurement is going to fall to a 15-year low this year. And this will be probably the first time when the government will be procuring less wheat than the stock it already has, which is a little unusual because, as you know, any firm will typically start any new year with less stocks and it will try and sell more from new production or from new purchases. Okay. So the main reason is your wheat production this year is lower. And my guess is our production is not more than 90 to 95 million tons. Whereas the government had projected a record output of something like 112 million tons.
Right, and the government was expecting this bumper harvest this time, and it had even planned to export wheat to countries across the world. But what is the reason that those expectations were not met and we did not see that bumper harvest?
See, the government was claiming not only a bumper, but a record crop this year. And when the government made that projection of 112 million tons, that was sometime in mid-February. And actually, at that point, the crop looked very good. But then we know what happened with this heat wave. It's completely decimated the wheat crop because, as we know, the heat came precisely at the time of grain filling. And grain filling is a time when the wheat kernels start accumulating dry matter, whether it is starch, protein, other nutrients, etc. So basically the crop which has come out, the grains have come out in a very shriveled form. So if we are talking of a production of say 90 to 95 million tons and not 112 million tons, that's a huge drop. And it makes all the more difference in today's scenario where international prices are also high. If I were to import wheat today, it won't be available for less than $500 a ton. So because of all this, we are now seeing wheat prices going up. And basically, it's a very deadly combination when both wheat and palm oil goes up. As you know that in bread or biscuits, it's all basically these two ingredients. The same goes with your noodles. So you have a scenario where definitely atta prices are rising and the government doesn't have enough stocks like last year. And plus, there is not enough stock even in the open market. And which is why you see wheat prices have shot up so much. And plus international prices are also high. So because of all this, I think that in the next few months, we are going to see definitely wheat prices rising. And I won't be surprised to see, say, wheat crossing 30 rupees and maybe atta crossing 35 rupees. And we are seeing it also in our bread. I think a standard loaf, that 400 gram loaf which used to get, white bread, which you were getting for about, say, 30 rupees. Today, I don't think you get it for less than about 38, 39 rupees. So we are seeing this definitely happening. So we are having a very strange inflation today where the two commodities which we took for granted, wheat and edible oil, both prices are really shooting up. And I don't think it is going to be the end because the fact is that there's not too much wheat available in the market or with the government.
Okay, so you have a situation where because of the heat wave, the wheat crop was really affected this year. You also have international prices of wheat being high because of the war in Ukraine. I mean, considering both Ukraine and Russia are high exporters of wheat. And the situation, as you mentioned, is even more serious because of the palm oil prices being high as well. But the other thing is that fuel prices for both diesel and petrol have been really high as well. Has that affected the price of wheat?
See, I would say that fuel prices obviously impacts all commodities, not just specific to wheat and this kind of a thing. It will impact even, say, milk prices, many things, because that affects the cost of transport in general. But in the case of wheat, this is very specific. So in the case of wheat, there are basically two factors. Number one, the war in Ukraine and Russia. As we know, I think those two countries together accounted for some 30% of the global exports. So with those ports shut down and all these things, with the Black Sea ports all shut down, not much exports happening from them. So automatically your world prices rose. But I think the second factor, which is still being underestimated, is the damage to the Indian crop. So I think one reason why also international prices have been going up in the past 1 month is because the world has got to know that India is having a short crop. I think the world expected that maybe India will partially fill the void which was left by Russia and Ukraine. Now, when that is also not available, so because of that, now suddenly international prices are rising because of that.
And Harish, considering the extent to which Indians consume wheat, how much is this expected to affect people on a day-to-day basis?
See, wheat at one time was largely consumed in North India, like in the South, etc. People hardly used to consume. But today, I think wheat is now consumed universally. Like, for example, in South, it is more maida and rava. Your upma is made from rava. And with maida, we make all this barota, which is consumed in Kerala, right? The Malabar barota. And same thing, like puri, upma, even noodles, and plus we know biscuits, bread. So I think wheat is a very sensitive commodity. It's a commodity of common consumption. And why this is a shock is because till say about 6 months back, it is all free wheat which is going around. And free wheat is what actually won the BJP the elections in Uttar Pradesh, right? So this sudden transformation, it is quite unbelievable. Whereas I think in the case of edible oil, it was already rising even before the war. I think even last year and the year before, already prices had started rising. Like in Malaysia, after COVID, there was no availability of plantation laborers in the palm oil plantations there. So there were all these kind of problems in edible oil. But whereas in the case of wheat, it has been sudden, sudden and unexpected. And it has been entirely because of this heat shock, the sudden rise in temperatures after mid March. And I think we had flagged this issue much before anybody else, and right from the beginning. So I think wheat is something which is going to be very sensitive in the days, because when we talk of wheat, it means roti. So I think it is much more. Whereas things like onion and all, it is more, I mean, onion is not an essential, but wheat is serious business, and the government has to do something about it.
And Harish, we also know that wheat is provided to people under various food security programs like the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Ann Yojana. Will those programs also be affected by this?
I think so. See, because as I said, we had opening stocks of, say, 19 million tons. And our procurement will be about, say, 18.5 million tons maximum. So that would be about 37.5 million tons. And we need our end year stocks to be at least 7.5 million tons, which is sort of a buffer. So that means you have about 30 million tons to play around with. So out of this 30 million tons, about 26 million tons is for the regular PDS, which is the scheme which was continuing even before COVID, etc. Even before the scheme which you are mentioning, the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Ann Yojana, even prior to that. So about 26 million tons will be used up in the regular PDS, which people get in their in their normal rations. So that leaves another 4 million tons. And in the past, about 3 to 4 million tons, the FCI was also making available to flour millers after October, November, during the lean season. It is more sort of what they call as open market sales scheme. Basically make available wheat after November, December, etc. to flour mills and to other bulk consumers. Basically, that is some kind of an open market operation as against selling through the PDS. So you need at any given time about, say, 4 million tons for open market operations and 26 million tons for the regular PDS. So when you add those two up, that itself is 30 million tons. So there is no scope for anything more than that. Because I think the free grain scheme, that is the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Ann Yojana, I think they had allocated about 10.9 million tons for April to September. But now I think they have already slashed it to, I think, about 4.5 million tons because they themselves know that the stocks are running out. And also there is a danger that this free grain may actually get exported. So there are a lot of scope for leakages, etc. So I think our wheat supply situation is very tight. So I think there'll be a lot of news on wheat in the days ahead. So watch the space.
And next, we talk about an exclusive report by the Indian Express. Back in 2020, when India was fighting its first wave of the pandemic, the Ministry of Finance's Economic Division was working on a strategy to counter the negative coverage that India had been getting during that time. And this is because the government was worried that because of the negative coverage, credit agencies like Moody's would downgrade India's sovereign rating. And such ratings by credit agencies are important because they significantly impact a country's ability to borrow money, which can thereby affect its economy. Now, Indian Express got to know more about this exercise undertaken by the government through a 36-page presentation that was prepared by Sanjeev Sanyal, the principal economic advisor in the Ministry of Finance. In this segment, Indian Express's Anisha Dutta, who broke the story, joins us to talk about it. So, Anisha, before we talk about your exclusive report, could you talk about the kind of negative press or commentary India was receiving before it undertook this exercise?
So the negative commentary monitored by the government mainly refers to reports in 2019 and 2020, and these are all commentaries on the Jammu and Kashmir Reorganization Act of 2019, the Citizenship Amendment Act of 2019, the NRC, the construction of the Ram Mandir. So the common theme in the negative commentary mentioned in the presentation is also highlights the Hindu nationalist nature of the Bharatiya Janata Party. And mainly, the report says that this is seen as an exercise of targeting Muslims and threatening the secular nature of a country. So this negative commentary about India is what worried the government also. And they mentioned that it's becoming the opinion of sovereign rating agencies while publishing a country reports. So mainly, these sovereign rating agencies weigh in what the World Bank's World Governance Indicator says. It is the single most important input in all these ratings agencies. So all these factors are mentioned in the report because according to the Finance Ministry, it also directly impacts the sovereign ratings.
Okay, so in order to counter this negative press, tell us, what did the Ministry of Finance decide to do?
So again, the presentation really highlights the importance of acting now. It mentions that there are subjective factors that impact India's sovereign ratings. It talks about why there's a need to pay attention to what the world governance indicators are saying. It also says that, further fall in the WGI is going to downgrade our sovereign ratings to junk. So there was a thinking in the government that is very important to reach out to these think tanks and survey agencies and set a positive narrative about India in general.
And this presentation included 36 pages. What do we know about what all it included, and what were the kind of things that were proposed?
So it talks about the importance of sovereign ratings and how subjective factors enter into the decision making. It speaks about the subjective factors it's mentioning includes its assessment of governance, political stability, rule of law in a country, corruption, press freedom, and so on. So there is a good analysis of how these factors enter our ratings. Then it talks about the importance of acting now because, like we mentioned in our report also, it says that Ministry of Finance's protests against these ratings reaped no results. So they mentioned that this consistent negative commentary about India is also becoming the opinion of sovereign rating agencies. Then it highlights the need to reach out to these agencies. There's an analysis on what each and every global indices have spoken about India. There's an analysis of what Moody's, Fitch, S&P are saying about India, and mainly also how they're impacting our WGI scores. So it also importantly mentions 15 such top data sources that the WGI includes. This includes your World Press Freedom Index, your Democracy Index by the Economics Intelligence Unit. It also includes varieties of democracy project reports, Freedom House reports, so on. And interestingly, it points that out of the 15 such data sources that they have collated, they mention 3 of them have an extremely negative stance on India. This includes the Economics Intelligence Unit, Varieties of Democracy Project, and the Freedom House. Also, the government mentions that the rest 12 of them are relatively have a neutral stance on India. So, idea is to reach out to these first. It mentions that these are the low hanging fruits. So the plan was to sort of reach out to these agencies first and then take it from there.
And you mentioned that the essential worry was that India's sovereign rating would be downgraded. So, why worry about it so much? What are the consequences that a country faces when its rating is downgraded?
See, it's very important. It basically gives the credit rating or an independent assessment of the credit worthiness of a country. So, sovereign ratings basically give investors insights of the level of risk associated with investing in a country, the debt of a particular country, and most importantly, the political risks as well. So we can see that sovereign ratings really impact the country's credit score. You can see countries like Sri Lanka who are suffering badly with default. Both S&P and Moody have continuously downgraded their ratings. So yes, it is a very important factor, especially in terms of economic policy planning for a country.
Yeah, and we have seen, for example, that when countries whose ratings are downgraded, let's say due to political instabilities, those countries, when borrowing money, are charged a much higher interest rate because of the risks associated with them, and which can then impact the overall economy of those countries. But now, in the past, India's ratings have been downgraded. What were the reasons for that?
So specifically, I will talk about Moody's and Fitch and DBRS Morningstar. So in 2020, June, Moody's downgraded India's ratings and it mentioned that the country's scores are moderate on institutional factors as measured by the worldwide governance indicators, reflecting modest government and policy effectiveness compared with peers. And meanwhile, Fitch revised India's outlook to negative in 2020 June. And it mentions India's geopolitical risk related to long-standing border issues with countries like China. It also mentions a relationship with Pakistan, which was negatively affected by the repeal of the special status for Kashmir, and also the recent changes to the status of illegal immigrants based on their religion. Fitch also mentioned that a stronger focus by the ruling BJP on its Hindu nationalist agenda since the government's re-election in May 2019 risks becoming a distraction for economic reforms and implementation, and also could further raise social tensions. So it features again in DBRS Morningstar's rating, which in May 2020 assigned negative trend to India. And it mentioned that India has had episodes of elevated social tension. It also mentioned proposals such as the NRC and the CAA could lead to an intensification of social unrest and sectarian divisions within the populace. So this is what the ratings agencies were saying in 2020, and this is right before this exercise began in June 2020. The idea was again to, of course, upgrade our ratings and reach out to these agencies in order to bring in a positive outlook.
And Anisha, having reported on it and having seen this presentation by the government to counter all the negative press, what is the thing that stands out to you the most about this?
See, first of all, it's an internal presentation. This was an internal government exercise. So it gives us an insight on as to how the government thinks. Most importantly, how policymakers are discussing these ratings. So what stands out most is one, that the exercise began in June 2020, right around the time we were dealing with our first wave of COVID. It also, again, what stands out is that the government's thought process is also to counter these negative commentaries. The government thinks that it is very important for narrative management. These are the terms that are repeatedly mentioned in presentation. It also says that it's very important to set a positive narrative about India by both think tanks and ratings agencies and the foreign media.
And in the end, we talk about the United Nations Security Council, or UNSC, one of the principal organs of the United Nations, which is charged with ensuring international peace and security. Last week, the UNSC issued its first presidential statement regarding the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has been going on for over 10 weeks now. Though the statement did not mention the word invasion or conflict or war, instead, it used the term dispute to describe the events. Indian Express's associate editor Shubhajit Roy explains how the statement came about. Shubhajit, the UNSC on Saturday issued its presidential statement where it talked about Ukraine. Now, before we talk about the statement itself, could you explain the significance a presidential statement has?
Well, ever since the Russian invasion of Ukraine took place, the UN Security Council has met several times. In fact, it had met before the aggression as well, but since the aggression took place, it's met several times, but it could never come up with a statement which accommodated everyone's concerns or language or was acceptable to everyone. So, a presidential statement is essentially issued only after there is unanimity amongst all 15 members, which includes 5 permanent and 10 non permanent members. Now, obviously, the permanent members have veto power, and either Russia or US, or other countries have the power to veto such statements. So, because there was no unanimity on any of the statements or any of the resolutions in the last 2.5 months, so there was no presidential statement that was issued after these meetings or no resolution that was adopted with unanimity. So that's the relevance of a presidential statement, because it means that all the members, all the permanent members as well as the non-permanent members, are for the first time have signed off on a statement where the language is acceptable to everyone.
And this statement has been making news because it refers to the Russian invasion of Ukraine as a dispute. It does not include words like war, conflict, or even invasion. And the statement is being criticized by some for this reason. So, why this description, and what do we know about how this statement came about?
So, firstly, we have to understand that the two sides, which is the Russian side and the Western countries led by the US, have not been able to find a common language for the last 10 weeks since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Therefore, this statement is the first where they have found common ground. Now, how does one find common ground? Is that it has tried to accommodate everyone's language, everyone's concerns. For example, the US, which holds the presidency of the UNSC for the month of May, or the Western countries, they describe the Russian invasion of Ukraine as either war or invasion or conflict. On the other hand, the Russian side describes it as a special military operation. Now, these are two different ways to describe the same set of events in Ukraine. Obviously, any of these 3 or 4 words, war, invasion, or conflict, which is used by the US-led West to describe the events, or the special military operation used by Russia, is not acceptable to both sides. So therefore, they have come up with a word which is acceptable to all sides, and that was dispute. Now, this particular statement, this particular word is obviously perceived to be a significantly diluted version or a watered down version of the descriptions that both sides. But that had to be done by negotiators who sort of spent last few weeks, as I understand, before they came up with this common acceptable language where Russia was on board with the language. If you remember in the past, Russia has blocked all the resolutions and using its veto power. So therefore, it has come under criticism. But what it also tells you is that for the first time in 10 weeks, this particular language is actually a common ground for both sides, where they have signed off on a common, unanimous, consensus-based presidential statement.
And considering we now have a statement that all the UNSC members agree on, could this help in advancing the talks between the two sides?
Yeah, obviously, Shashank, that is the hope that this particular statement is a starting point, could be a starting point for future negotiations. As India has been sort of saying for the last 2.5 months that, direct talks between the two sides will only lead to peaceful resolution. And dialogue and diplomacy is the only path forward towards the resolution of the situation. India has also flagged one of the things prior to the presidential statement being adopted. If you saw the statement, the two things India essentially has flagged. One is that, this conflict if it goes on like this, and it's been already 2.5 months almost, that diplomacy will be the lasting casualty. And the other point that India has raised is about humanitarian aid, which is a concern expressed by many, but India has articulated it for the first time before this presidential statement. And that is that right now, if World Food Program sending humanitarian aid to Ukraine or the adjoining countries where refugees are sort of fleeing and going there are no taxes for sending that humanitarian aid. But if individual countries, including India, if it sends humanitarian aid, it is subject to taxes, which India has sort of raised this issue that, even individual countries and other organizations other than World Food Program should also be exempted from these taxes and these restrictions. Otherwise, it hampers providing humanitarian aid to people in need at this point of time.
You were listening to Three Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargava, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.